The White House says hundreds of executions scheduled in Iran have been halted. President Trump says he heard on, quote, good authority that the killing of protesters in Iran has stopped. Human rights groups warn, though, the death toll from the regime's crackdown on anti-government protests has surged into the thousands. The leader of an armed opposition group sat down with CBS News in the mountains of Iraq. CBS News foreign correspondent Holly Williams tells us the leader says the group is ready to take on the regime at the right moment.
President Trump has repeatedly threatened to hit Iran hard in recent days, but with thousands of protesters thought to have been killed in a crackdown, yesterday he said he would, quote, watch and see what the process is. He said he had received assurances that the killings would stop and that there would be no executions. Now, Iranian human rights groups had warned that one protester, Irfan Soltani, was scheduled to be executed yesterday. The regime now says he hasn't been sentenced to death. Iran's government may have ended its campaign of deadly reprisals, but the protests have likely left it weakened. In the mountains of northern Iraq, just 30 miles or so from the border with Iran, we met with fighters from an armed and outlawed Iranian opposition group, the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan. Now, the group represents the Kurdish ethnic minority, which makes up around 10% of Iran's population. Many of their fighters are women, and they're training for the day the Iranian regime can be ousted from power. One of their commanders told us that despite the terrible violence, in a way, the protests give them hope because they show it may be possible to topple the regime, although she said that may require international help. The group's leader told us they have thousands of members inside Iran who can be armed and mobilized at the right moment. He also said that he would welcome U.S. strikes if they targeted the security forces that help keep the Iranian regime in power. Back to you.
Thank you for that. Well, as President Trump appears to step back from the threats of intervention in Iran, the U.S. military remains ready to strike. Officials say U.S. bases stay on alert with an array of options and assets. So let's bring in CBS News senior national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata. Charlie, great to see you. So what options does the U.S. military have at the ready?
You use the word array. There is an array of assets throughout the entire region. We'll start with Al Udeid. This is the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East. It's got 10,000 U.S. forces there. They brought down that number slightly yesterday because of the tensions against Iran. Iran has attacked Al Udeid significantly, bombarded Al Udeid in the past after the attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities back in June in Operation Midnight Hammer. At that time, there were only a few dozen military personnel that were still there. So the tension is still there. But in addition to the Al Udeid, you've got an airstrip inside Jordan itself with F-15 fighter jets, which in action last week in attacks against ISIS targets in Syria. There are a number of, we talk about the attacks on the nuclear facilities in Iran. Those are actually spearheaded by B-2 bombers, which left from the United States. Now, interestingly, we're tracking, we haven't got complete confirmation on this yet, but we're tracking an aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, which may have been ordered to get into that region, the Middle East, from the South China Sea. That, it's not a game changer, but whenever I've talked about any of these military operations, significant military operations in the Middle East, you're always going to have a carrier in the neighborhood. It serves as a deterrent. There are F-18 fighter jets on board that carrier, but it also comes, we call it a carrier strike group. It comes with a number of destroyers that are capable of launching Tomahawk cruise missiles, because with the military, policy may waver, but when the military is involved, they are concentrated on objectives and then after effects. And number one priority after getting these targets is making sure that troops are protected, force protection. And if you want force protection, you've got to have a carrier in the neighborhood to do that.
Charlie, we saw Iran shut down its airspace and then hours later reopen it. Now, whenever that happens, that usually signals that's a big deal. Does that give us any indication about how close the U.S. might be to possible military intervention?
Yes, and we were on edge last night. We were all standing by just in case the United States was about to launch airstrikes in Iran, because, officials that I spoke to said, as you said, the United States remains poised to do that at any time. So last night for a few hours, Iran closed down its airspace. The objectives of doing that are really twofold. First of all, the obvious one, they want to avoid any sort of confliction where commercial jets or commercial aircraft might be engaged or might be in harm's way. So they want to put that out. It's called a NOTAM, Notice to Airmen, to avoid that area. But additionally, it's essentially saying that any aircraft found over Iranian airspace would be considered adversarial and therefore open to targeting. So that was kind of messaging to the United States as well. But yes, we saw the alert go up in Israel last night, this NOTAM, the Notice to Airmen, closing off Iranian airspace. So certainly the Iranians were taking it very seriously. We couldn't be entirely sure here. You know, the sources that we speak to, we wouldn't even ask the question if there's going to be compromise for operational security. We're not going to say, are you going to bomb Iran at 8 o'clock tonight? Mm-hmm. We just wouldn't have those conversations for obvious reasons. But there are certain signatures that we pick up on. Is there increased airspace over Al Udeid in Qatar? Is there increased fighter jet flights over places like Syria and Iraq? So we keep a close eye on that because these are indicators that something might be coming up, and Iran was looking at that too.
I want to ask you about the communication, though, that we're getting out of Iran, because yesterday CNN asked the president, you know, are you confident? How do you know that the executions have stopped, that the killings have stopped against protesters? And the president indicated that he had been speaking with sources inside the country, but he also said, but, you know, who knows? So how confident are we that we're getting accurate information coming out of that country that could impact whether or not the U.S. intervenes?
Yeah, Liz, you know, there's a term they used, information operations, and that is kind of signaling. So for the past, I think it's more than a week, I think it's been about 10 days, that President Trump has been threatening Iran, saying if you keep killing protesters, you know, there are going to be consequences. So when we heard that information yesterday, and he had actually said that he had closed communications, if you remember a couple of days ago, he said, we're not even speaking to the Iranians. But there are obviously channels of communication that are happening, back channels. It's hard to verify. Even us journalists, CBS News, my colleagues in the Middle East and London have great contacts within Iran. It's been difficult for all kinds of reasons, communications, internet blackouts, etc., to get a clear idea of what's going on there. But for whatever reason, whether it was the decision that President Trump felt satisfied that these killings had stopped and these executions weren't going forward, we certainly know the Iranians have come forward. They've been on television speaking to everybody to try to sort of argue their case. They certainly don't want hell to rain down on Iran because of what's happened here. And they're talking about existential threats here to the regime. You know, this isn't about taking out the nuclear programs. It's about a threat to the regime itself. So yes, it stands to reason that these levels and channels of communication are happening, but we also have to think of if somebody says something, how does that affect the other side? And that's coming from both sides. It's coming from the White House, it's coming from Tehran. It's to deconflict. But when that carrier gets there, if it is headed there, that's going to take like 5 to 7 days to get there anyway before it becomes meaningful to the battle environment. But that does change things. My predecessor, David Martin, who you've spoken to, has always said nothing gets the attention of the Iranians like an aircraft carrier. So that will change significantly the situation in the Middle East.
Charlie D'Agata, always great to talk to you. Thanks so much.